One comment left on the last video earned 676 likes. It read, Bronze Era physiques confirm that most Silver Era physiques could have been produced naturally. That's the claim. This video is going to test it with actual measurements, because an argument made with data is worth more than one made with feelings, and this audience deserves the data version. Before the numbers, a brief accounting of what's actually riding on this question for a lot of people watching. Steve Reeves and John Grimek aren't simply historical curiosities to natural lifters. They function as proof of concept. As one commenter in natural bodybuilding communities put it, I have always admired Steve Reeves because his body looked to be very close to ideal in my opinion, and his body appears to be somewhat achievable by an all-natural lifter. That's the psychological function, not just inspiration, but validation. Evidence that decades of consistent, drug-free training can produce something genuinely extraordinary. Reeves is cited as a proportion benchmark in physique discussions even now. His measurements, 29-inch waist, 52-inch chest, 18-inch arms, have been used as aspirational targets since he first appeared on screen as Hercules in 1958. Grimek won Mr. America twice and Mr. Universe once, and Iron Game lore rightly recognizes John Grimek as one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time. When these men get implicated in hormone use, it doesn't just revise history. For a certain kind of lifter, it revises the future. The ceiling they represented drops. The validation disappears. That's worth naming before anything else, because the people who feel this most acutely aren't wrong to feel it. The Silver Era physiques carry real psychological weight. The question is whether that weight is supported by the facts, and there's a more reliable anchor available than a contested letter from 1943. That letter is the source of most of the current debate, so a brief accounting of what's actually known about it. A video analyzing Silver Era drug use surfaced what it described as a letter from John Grimek, written in 1943, in which Grimek reportedly inquired about testosterone, or methyl testosterone. The primary document hasn't been independently located or authenticated against primary archival sources. What's documented is its characterization as an inquiry, not an admission of use. The community split predictably over it. One camp argued that Grimek's 1940 and 1941 Mr. America victories predate the letter, so his championship physique was built before any possible hormonal assistance. The other argued that even the inquiry suggests the Silver Era's presumed clean status is suspect. Both positions have circulated widely. Both rest on an unverified document. The debate has generated enormous engagement and almost no resolution. So instead of arguing further about a letter whose contents remain uncertain, the bodies themselves can settle the more important question. That's what measurements are for. The measuring tool is FFMI, Fat-Free Mass Index. In October 1995, Elena Corey, Harrison Pope, David Katz, and Paul Oliva published a study in the Clinical Journal of Sport Medicine. Their sample was 157 male athletes, 83 steroid users, 74 non-users. The formula divides fat-free body mass in kilograms by height in meters squared. They applied a normalization correction, adding 6.3 multiplied by 1.80 meters minus the athlete's actual height to allow fair comparisons across different heights. A 5' 9" athlete gets a slight upward adjustment. A 6' 1" athlete gets a slight downward one. What their clinical non-user sample showed: normalized FFMI values extended up to 25.0, with no confirmed non-user exceeding it. That's the figure that entered popular culture as the hard, natural ceiling. But the same study also analyzed 20 Mr. America winners from the pre-steroid era, 1939 through 1959, and found a mean normalized FFMI of 25.4. 13 of those 20 athletes scored above 25, 8 scored above 26, 3 scored above 27. The peak FFMI in that cohort was 28.0. The study that supposedly establishes a hard, natural ceiling of 25 contains data from elite pre-steroid athletes, where the average sits above 25. The discrepancy comes from who was in each sample. The clinical non-users were competitive athletes, not necessarily the genetic outliers who win national physique titles after 2 or 3 decades of dedicated training. Researcher Greg Nuckols, who published a detailed analysis of the Corey data, called the interpretation of 25 as a natural ceiling a very poor interpretation of science. A study of NCAA Division I and II football players found that over 26% of players had adjusted FFMI values above 25 with no confirmed drug use. And the researchers concluded that the 25 threshold underestimates the natural FFMI limit for that population. The ceiling appears to reflect what typical competitive athletes reach, not what extraordinary genetics combined with decades of disciplined training can produce. FFMI isn't a detection device. It's a comparative lens, a body fat adjusted way to ask whether two physiques are operating in the same range of muscularity. With that lens in place, the question becomes what the Bronze Era athletes actually measured, because they are the only athletes who can serve as an unimpeachable pre-drug control group. The Bronze Era spans roughly the mid-1890s through the 1930s. Synthetic testosterone was first synthesized in 1935. Nobody in this era had access to anabolic steroids. That makes Bronze Era physiques the cleanest available baseline for what human bodies can build without them. With one honest caveat worth naming. Cocaine, opiates, and amphetamines were legally available during this period, and there's historical documentation of stimulant use among some athletes of the era. Whether any Bronze Era bodybuilders used them, and whether stimulants would have meaningfully affected physique development, isn't established. What can be said with confidence is that synthetic androgens, the specific compounds at the center of the Silver Era controversy, didn't exist. These bodies were built before the pharmacological question was even possible. Eugene Sandow is the anchor data point. Born Friedrich Wilhelm Müller in Königsberg in 1867, he began his theatrical strongman career in 1887 and became the defining figure of the physical culture movement, described by historians as the father of modern bodybuilding. In 1893, Dudley Allen Sargent, Harvard's director of physical education since 1879, conducted a formal anthropometric examination of Sandow at the university's Hemingway Gymnasium. Sargent applied his standard 40 measurement protocol, the same one he used with Harvard students, and documented Sandow against population norms. His formally recorded conclusion? Sandow was the most wonderful specimen of man I have ever seen. For the measurements themselves, the picture is slightly complicated by source reliability. In a 1914 magazine interview, Sandow stated he stood 5 feet 8.5 inches with a 48-inch chest and 30-inch waist. Other sources place his height at 5 feet 9 inches and his weight between 185 and 206 pounds, depending on the period. His arms are documented at approximately 18 inches in aggregations drawing on contemporary records. Sandow was also accused by contemporaries of employing what one academic source describes as questionable techniques, shading in photographs, self-reported measurements favoring larger figures, which creates a genuine source reliability problem. Using the higher weight figure of 206 pounds at 5 feet 8 inches, the calculated FFMI approaches 28. At 185 pounds at 5 feet 9 inches with moderate body fat, it drops toward 25. The honest assessment is that his actual FFMI falls somewhere in that range. Even at the conservative end, Sandow was operating near or above the commonly cited natural ceiling, and he had no access to any synthetic compound. George Hackenschmidt, born in 1877, is the better documented physical case. The Baltic German strongman and champion wrestler stood 5 feet 9 inches and carried documented measurements from historical sources. A 52-inch chest, 19-inch arms, a 22-inch neck. His competition weight is recorded at various points between roughly 190 and 204 pounds. A Facebook caption accompanying a period photograph noted that Hackenschmidt was so jacked people often think he was far heavier than 86 kilograms, which is what he weighs in this picture. 86 kilograms is about 190 pounds. At 204 pounds and 5 feet 9.5 inches, with an estimated 10 to 12% body fat for peak condition, his FFMI falls in the range of 26.0 to 26.6. His pressing history is directly relevant to the bench press comparison later. Around 1899, Hackenschmidt rolled a barbell over his face, lay flat on the floor, and performed the first recorded floor press. His documented training methodology, described in his book, The Way to Live, centered on high repetitions of body weight and dumbbell work, calisthenics, gymnastics, and wrestling. The floor press, not the bench press. No elevated bench, no arch, no full pectoral stretch. Hackenschmidt's chest measured 52 inches under those conditions at that body weight with nothing synthetic in his system. That measurement becomes a reference point when the bench press adoption story gets told. Arthur Saxon, the German strongman billed as the Iron Master and featured with the Ringling Brothers Circus, provides a third data point. Contemporary measurements by British strongman Thomas Inch, a peer who knew Saxon personally, document him at 5 feet 10 inches and 200 pounds. His bent press world record was 371 pounds. At those anthropometrics, with an estimated competition body fat around 12%, Saxon's FFMI sits at approximately 25.2, meaningfully developed by any standard, though below the peak figures of Sandow and Hackenschmidt. Saxon's physique was described by contemporaries as powerfully functional rather than visually imposing in the Sandow style. He was known more for his extraordinary strength than for the aesthetic proportions that defined Sandow's performances. His lower FFMI is consistent with that description. Charles Atlas, the most commercially famous figure of the era, rounds out the range. Born Angelo Siciliano, his documented measurements, 5 feet 10 inches, 185 to 195 pounds, 17-inch arms, 47-inch chest, 32-inch waist. His estimated FFMI at those figures falls between 23 and 24.5, depending on body fat assumption. Atlas competed in physique displays rather than heavyweight lifting contests and built his career around transformation photography in mail-order fitness programs rather than elite competition. His numbers represent the lower bound of the Bronze Era range, not its ceiling, the baseline of what dedicated physical culture practice produced in a non-elite specimen of the era. What that range establishes: Bronze Era elite physiques, produced before synthetic testosterone existed, clustered from roughly 23 to the high 20s on normalized FFMI. Hackenschmidt and Sandow, the two most physically developed figures in this group, appear to have operated above 26, possibly higher. Saxon sits near 25. Atlas, the generalist and marketer, came in around 23 to 24. That's the pre-drug baseline. That's the control group. John Grimek won Mr. America in both 1940 and 1941, then Mr. Universe in 1948. Multiple independently confirmed sources agree on his competition condition measurements. Height, 5 feet 8.5 inches. Competition weight, 195 pounds. Arms documented at 17.5 to 18 inches flexed. Chest, 47 inches. Waist, 31 inches. The strength documentation accompanying those measurements was extraordinary for the era. A 600-pound deadlift, a 700-pound squat, an overhead press of 364 pounds, a bench press of 480 pounds. At 195 pounds, 5 feet 8.5 inches, with an estimated competition body fat of around 8%, his calculated FFMI is approximately 26.9. With the Corey normalization applied for his height, it rises to approximately 27.3. The FFMI data compiled from the Corey study lists Grimek's 1941 figure at 26.9. Community calculations reach the same number independently. His physique in 1940 and 1941 sat above the commonly cited 25 ceiling, but exactly in range with what the Corey study's own data found for pre-steroid Mr. America winners as a cohort. The timeline of Grimek's documented testosterone involvement is worth stating precisely. Historical records document that Grimek was included in injectable testosterone experiments at York Barbell in 1952. That's 7 years after his first Mr. America win, 4 years after his Mr. Universe, and after his competitive prime was effectively over. What occurred in those 1952 experiments is documented. What was built and displayed on stage in 1940 and 1941 at 195 pounds and a normalized FFMI of 27.3 preceded it by a decade. Steve Reeves won Mr. America in 1947, Mr. World in 1948, and NABBA Mr. Universe in 1950. His height, 6 feet 1 inch, is consistent across every source that records it. His weight varies slightly, depending on contest and period. The Steve Reeves International Society lists his competition weight at 216 pounds. Muscle Memory lists 213 pounds. Reeves himself, in a telephone interview, stated that he was 6 feet 1 inch and weighed 225 pounds, with low body fat, and that those measurements were taken at the NABBA Mr. Universe in 1950 by a NABBA official. That 225-pound figure likely reflects his weight at the specific 1950 contest. He may have been heavier at Mr. Universe than at his earlier Mr. America. Researcher Casey Butt, who has conducted extensive analysis of natural bodybuilding potential and developed his own maximum muscular potential calculator using skeletal measurements, estimated Reeves at approximately 214 pounds at 9% body fat for his peak condition data. His documented measurements from the official Reeves International Society: 18.25-inch biceps, 52-inch chest, 29-inch waist, 26-inch thighs, 18.25-inch calves, 18.5-inch neck. The 29-inch waist is confirmed by multiple independent sources and isn't in dispute. The arm measurement carries a minor discrepancy worth naming. Muscle Memory lists his arms at 17.5 inches and his waist at 31 inches, which differs from the official society records and from Reeves's own stated measurements. Those competing figures are both in the literature. The range of 17.5 to 18.25 inches is the honest answer for his arm size. Using the Society's 216 pounds and Casey Butt's 9% body fat estimate at 6 feet 1 inch, calculated FFMI is approximately 25.96. Normalized for his height, which generates a slight downward adjustment because he's taller than the 5 feet 11 inches reference, his normalized FFMI falls to approximately 25.6. That places Reeves above the commonly cited 25 ceiling, but directly within the mean of 25.4 that the Corey study found for the pre-steroid Mr. America cohort as a whole. Harrison Pope, one of the Corey study's co-authors, included a photograph that Reeves himself provided for the Adonis complex and described an FFMI of 25 to 26 as representing the upper natural limit, with Reeves explicitly as the reference point. Leroy Colbert is the case that resists easy calculation, but carries the most striking contemporaneous documentation. Muscle Power magazine's November 1953 issue published his measurements directly: 21.5-inch arms, 52-inch chest, 32-inch waist, 28-inch thighs, 205 pounds. Colbert is consistently identified as the first bodybuilder to develop 21-inch arms drug-free. His height isn't confirmed in the available historical record with enough precision to run a complete FFMI calculation, and that gap is worth stating plainly rather than filling with an estimate. What can be assessed? At 205 pounds with 21.5-inch arms, published in a contemporaneous printed source in 1953, his arm development substantially exceeds what any proportional benchmark would predict. His arm-to-body weight ratio is exceptional by any era standard. He functions as a bridge case precisely because his measurements, if taken at face value, push further than the FFMI framework expects from any era. Whether that reflects genetic outlier status at the extreme edge of natural potential or something else is genuinely unresolved. When the numbers from both eras are placed side by side, the picture that emerges isn't a clean separation. It's overlap. Hackenschmidt, 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 9.5 inches, approximately 190 to 204 pounds, 19-inch arms, 52-inch chest, normalized FFMI estimated at 26.0 to 26.6. Built without any synthetic compound, without a bench press, without commercial protein. Floor presses and wrestling in a 19th century gymnasium. Grimek, 5 feet 8.5 inches, 195 pounds, competition weight. 17.5 to 18-inch arms, 47-inch chest, normalized FFMI, approximately 26.9 to 27.3. Silver Era champion. Sandow, 5 feet 8.5 inches to 5 feet 9 inches, estimated 185 to 206 pounds, approximately 18-inch arms, 48-inch chest, FFMI in a range consistent with or potentially exceeding Grimek's, depending on which weight figure is used. Built a decade before synthetic testosterone was synthesized. Reeves, 6 feet 1 inch, 216 pounds, 18.25-inch arms, 52-inch chest, 29-inch waist, normalized FFMI, approximately 25.6. Silver Era champion. Saxon, 5 feet 10 inches, 200 pounds, FFMI, approximately 25.2. No synthetic compounds. George Eiferman, Mr. America, 1948, is worth adding here because the Corey data specifically documents him. His FFMI reached 27.7 in 1948, the highest in the pre-steroid Mr. America cohort, alongside Grimek's 26.9. Both men competed before the York barbell testosterone experiments of the early 1950s. Both exceeded what the conventional 25 ceiling argument would predict for natural athletes. The Bronze Era athletes weren't uniformly below their Silver Era counterparts. Hackenschmidt and Sandow, built without anything that wasn't available in a late Victorian gymnasium, appear to have operated at FFMI levels comparable to or exceeding Grimek's. Arthur Saxon sits at roughly the same normalized FFMI as Reeves's peak score. The gap between the eras, where a gap exists at all, doesn't require a hormonal explanation to account for it. That gap needs a different answer. Two changes happened between the eras that deserve more credit than they typically receive in this comparison. The first is the bench press. Hackenschmidt's 1899 floor press, flat on the ground, barbell rolled over his face, was the Bronze Era standard for horizontal pressing. The floor press constrains range of motion. The upper arm stops when the elbows contact the floor, which limits the stretch on the pectoral at the bottom position. No arch is possible. The mechanics physically restrict how much pectoral length tension the exercise can access. In the 1930s, Mark Berry's book, Physical Improvement and Physical Training Simplified, introduced photographs of lifters pressing on raised benches. Modest documentation, but it established the movement in print. By the late 1940s, the bench press had become a primary training movement for bodybuilders and strength athletes. Steve Reeves' documented training programs include bench press and incline press variations as standard components. George Eiferman, the first athlete specifically recognized for bench pressing in competitive bodybuilding, earned $50 for pressing 250 pounds for 20 repetitions. His upper chest development was specifically cited as what distinguished him. The bench press allows a greater range of motion through the pectorals, higher loading potential, and access to the fully stretched bottom position that the floor press eliminates. Decades of bench pressing rather than floor pressing would plausibly produce greater pectoral thickness and the specific visual chest-to-shoulder development that defines the Silver Era aesthetic. Reeves' 52-inch chest against a 29-inch waist is a proportion that bench training enables more directly than floor pressing does. That's not a hormonal story, that's a tool story. The second change is nutrition infrastructure. Both eras lacked formal sports science in the modern sense. Available evidence suggests that both Bronze and Silver Era lifters operated substantially on experience and intuition rather than precise nutritional protocols. But they weren't equivalent. Bob Hoffman at York Barbell had been publishing Strength and Health magazine since the late 1930s and operating a supplement business by the 1940s. Historical documentation describes his efforts to market protein products to competitive lifters through direct publication. His magazine reached the exact audience. By 1952, Hoffman launched a soy-based protein product described as one of the first mass-produced commercial protein supplements. Earlier, he had distributed a product called High Protein to York athletes and readers. Bronze-era lifters had no equivalent commercial infrastructure at all. Sandow's nutrition discussions in his 1897 publication, Strength and How to Obtain It, described general dietary principles, not structured protein targeting. The nutritional gap between a turn-of-the-century strongman eating intuitively and the 1940s bodybuilder with access to supplemental protein and structured diet guidance from a dedicated publication is real, even if it can't be assigned a specific number of pounds of additional muscle mass. Neither change, bench press adoption, nor improved nutrition access has been studied in a controlled way that would allow a precise calculation of how much additional muscularity they could explain. That's an honest limitation, but they are plausible, documented, non-hormonal mechanisms for whatever gap exists between bronze and silver era physiques. And that gap, measured in FFMI terms, isn't large enough to require anything more than those two explanations to account for. The most specific pharmacological argument for silver-era natural status comes from a commenter identified as Casey Butt, a lifelong natural lifter and researcher who developed what is known as the Maximum Muscular Potential Calculator, a formula using height, wrist circumference, and ankle circumference to estimate the upper boundary of natural muscular development. His formula, m equals height to the 1.5 power, multiplied by combinations of wrist and ankle measurements, has been cited as one of the more rigorous attempts to individualize natural potential estimates. The position attributed to him with significant community engagement argues that early methyl testosterone was largely ineffective, and therefore that athletes who inquired about or obtained the compound in the 1940s may have derived little meaningful benefit from it. The argument deserves precise framing before evaluation. Methyl testosterone was synthesized in 1935 and introduced for medical use in 1936. The 17-alpha-methylation that defines the compound was developed specifically to solve oral testosterone's bioavailability problem. Unmodified testosterone taken orally undergoes extensive first-pass liver metabolism that severely limits its effect. The methyl group was added to resist that metabolism. Medical literature documents methyl testosterone as an anabolic and androgenic compound used clinically for testosterone deficiency, wasting conditions, and other applications requiring androgenic activity. A JAMA internal medicine comparison paper used methyl testosterone as the reference standard for measuring another compound's anabolic and androgenic efficacy, which implies the reference compound has documented measurable activity. Methyl testosterone wasn't inert. Where Casey Butt's argument has legitimate force is in the practical conditions of 1940s use. Athletes of that era had no knowledge of optimal dosing protocols, no understanding of cycle timing, no access to the pharmacological literature that would eventually structure modern use, and were operating with therapeutic dose formulations designed for deficiency treatment rather than supraphysiological loading. The compound's anabolic potency was also lower than the purpose-designed anabolics developed through the 1950s and 1960s. So the honest version of the argument isn't that methyl testosterone produced no anabolic effect. The pharmacological record contradicts that. But that athletes using it in the 1940s under therapeutic conditions, without optimized protocols, may have derived substantially less benefit than later athletes using purpose-built anabolics at higher doses with informed strategies. This is Casey Butt's argument, presented at the level of precision the pharmacological literature actually supports. It's the position of one experienced analyst, not a pharmacological consensus, and the strongest form of it differs meaningfully from the way it's sometimes summarized in community discussion. The gap between largely ineffective and less effective than later compounds used without optimized protocols is worth maintaining because the second version is defensible and the first isn't. There's one more piece of timeline context that doesn't resolve the debate but sharpens what's actually contested. Historical records document that administrators at York Barbell began providing testosterone shots to select trainees at some point in the early 1950s. The specific documented cases include Grimek, a 1952 Mr. World fourth-place finisher, and the 1952 Mr. America winner, Jim Park. Those experiments are in 1952. Grimek's competition physique, the one at 195 pounds, 27.3 normalized FFMI, that won the national title twice, was built and competed with before any of that. If there's a window in which Grimek's physique existed cleanly, it's the window documented by his competition measurements: 1940, 1941, 1948. The 1952 experiments don't retroactively address that window. They define what came after it. Steve Reeves presents a different situation. No equivalent documentary evidence for exogenous hormone use by Reeves has appeared in the historical record. No letter, no experiment, no contemporaneous account. His normalized FFMI of approximately 25.6 sits exactly at the mean of what the Corey study found for pre-steroid Mr. America winners as a group. Harrison Pope included Reeves as the photographic reference point for the 25 to 26 natural upper limit in academic work. The measurements, the comparators, and the historical record all place Reeves comfortably within what pre-drug competition physiques demonstrably produced. The original comments claim that Bronze-era physiques confirm most Silver-era physiques could have been produced naturally holds up when the data is examined athlete by athlete. Hackenschmidt built a 52-inch chest and 19-inch arms using floor presses, calisthenics, and wrestling in a 19th century gymnasium. Sandow carried an estimated FFMI in the same range as Grimek's championship physique, and Sandow died in 1925, a decade before testosterone was synthesized. The Bronze-era athletes weren't a scaled-down precursor to the Silver era. They were operating in the same physical territory. That's the data point that reframes the entire debate. The question was never whether Silver-era physiques were extraordinary. They were. The question is whether they were extraordinary beyond what natural human physiology could produce. And the Bronze-era record says no, but because it produced comparable measurements without the compounds. Corey's own pre-steroid Mr. America data makes this specific. 20 men competing between 1939 and 1959 averaged a normalized FFMI of 25.4. The individual peaks, Grimek at 26.9, Eiferman at 27.7, sit above the 25 ceiling, but directly in range with what the Bronze-era comparison suggests. These aren't numbers that require exogenous hormones to explain. They're numbers that require exceptional genetics, decades of dedicated training, progressively heavier loading, and, by the Silver era specifically, access to the bench press and improved nutritional infrastructure that the Bronze era lacked. The uncertainties are real and worth naming rather than minimizing. Leroy Colbert's 21.5-inch arms at 205 pounds, published in Muscle Power in November 1953, remain difficult to fully evaluate without a confirmed height figure. His measurements push further than any benchmark in this discussion, and no certain explanation exists for them. The historical record for Bronze-era anthropometrics carries its own noise. Sandow's measurements were partially self-reported, and the body fat percentages used in these FFMI calculations are estimates derived from what's physiologically plausible, not DEXA data. Grimek's 1952 involvement in testosterone experiments is documented, even if his championship physique preceded it. The pharmacological debate over methyltestosterone's real-world effectiveness in 1940s conditions is genuinely unresolved in the ways Casey Butt's argument usefully highlights, even if the strongest version of that argument overstates the case. But the burden of proof runs in a specific direction here. To argue that Silver-era physiques required exogenous hormonal assistance, You need to demonstrate a gap between what natural training could produce and what those athletes actually measured. A gap large enough that alternative explanations can't close it. The Bronze Era data doesn't show that gap. Hackenschmidt and Sandow, operating under conditions definitionally free of synthetic testosterone, measured in the same range as Grimek and above Reeves. The bench press and improved nutrition infrastructure provide a plausible non-hormonal account of whatever difference does exist between eras. The measurement overlap is the evidence, and it runs toward the natural explanation. If Steve Reeves was the physique you had in mind when you decided that lifelong natural training was the goal, if his 6-foot 1-inch frame, his 29-inch waist against a 52-inch chest, his 18-inch arms represented something real and attainable, the Bronze Era record doesn't undercut that. It confirms it. Hackenschmidt's physique, built without anything that wasn't available in a 19th century training hall, maps onto the same measurable range. The natural ceiling was never as low as the Grimek letter debate implied. Bronze Era athletes were already there, or close to it, before testosterone was a word anyone in a gymnasium knew. The dream your training is built around is intact. The measurement said so before anyone asked the question. Subscribe for more evidence-first analysis of bodybuilding history.